Auctioneer laughed, even the brothel rejected her. But a sheriff took her hand and said, "I'll buy." Sarah had always known that life wasn't easy. From the moment she was born, she had felt the harshness of the world around her. She had grown up in a poor family, in a small town where hope seemed like a distant dream for most people. Her father had left when she was just a baby, and her mother struggled to provide for her and her younger brother. They barely had enough food to eat and often had to make do with whatever they could find. The old house they lived in was small, dark, and cold. The walls were cracked and the roof leaked when it rained, but it was home and it was all they had. When Sarah was about 10 years old, her mother passed away. The illness had been slow, and Sarah had watched helplessly as her mother's health declined. She was the one who had to take care of her younger brother, trying to keep him safe and fed while watching their world crumble around them. After her mother's death, Sarah tried to make the best of things, but without her mother's guidance, it felt like she was just drifting, trying to hold onto something she didn't understand. She managed to stay in school for a while, but the other kids made her feel different. They had families, clothes that didn't have holes in them, and food on the table every night. Sarah was always embarrassed by the way she looked. Her clothes were worn and too small, and she was often teased for it. The kids at school would laugh at her, call her names, and ignore her whenever she tried to make friends. The only place she felt somewhat safe was at home, with her brother, where they could dream about better days, even though deep down she knew they weren't coming. As Sarah got older, things didn't improve. The poverty they lived in seemed to close in on her like a suffocating fog. She had to leave school before she was even 16 to find work, anything that would bring in a little money. She tried washing dishes at a local diner, but the work was hard, and the owner treated her like she was nothing more than a tool for his business. The customers were rude, and the tips were barely enough to feed her brother, let alone herself. Still, she pushed on, determined to do whatever it took to survive. After a while, she moved on to other jobs, working in laundry rooms, cleaning houses, and even taking on odd jobs for people around town. It wasn't much, but it was something. But no matter how hard she worked, there was always something missing. She dreamed of a different life, a life where she didn't have to scrape by every day, but those dreams felt as if they were too far out of reach, too far to ever grasp. When she turned 18, Sarah was approached by a woman named Ruby who ran a brothel just outside of town. Ruby had a reputation for taking in girls who had nowhere else to go, and she promised Sarah a steady job, food, and a place to stay. Sarah was desperate at that point, and while she didn't want to take that path, she felt as if she had no choice. She was tired of struggling, tired of watching her brother suffer because there was no money to buy food or clothes. She hoped, maybe naively, that this job could give her the stability she needed to make a better life for both of them. When she arrived at Ruby's brothel, Sarah was greeted with an indifferent look. Ruby wasn't kind, but she wasn't cruel either. She simply looked Sarah over and told her that she could work there, but only if she was willing to meet certain expectations. Sarah didn't have much of a choice, so she agreed. She was shown to a small room, and although it was clean, it felt cold and empty. There were other women there, but they didn't speak much to her. Some looked at her with pity, while others seemed to ignore her completely. Sarah tried to keep her head down and focus on the work, but every night when the customers came in, she felt more and more like an object, something to be used and discarded. Despite her discomfort, Sarah tried to push through, telling herself that this was the only way out of her situation. But as time went on, she realized that this was no way to live. The brothel didn't offer her the stability she had hoped for. It only made her feel more isolated, more trapped. She wanted to leave, to go somewhere far away, but she had no money, no skills, and no family to turn to. She couldn't go back to the town because it was filled with memories of her childhood, and everything in that town reminded her of how much she had lost. So she stayed, day after day, feeling her spirit slowly fade. One evening, Sarah was called to meet with Ruby. She sat across from her, feeling a sense of dread building in her chest. Ruby stared at her for a moment, as if she were sizing her up before speaking. "You're not what we're looking for," Ruby said coldly, as if Sarah's very presence was an inconvenience. "You don't fit in with the other girls. You're too quiet, too shy, and the customers, they don't like you. I don't think you'll work here long. You're just not cut out for this life." The words hit Sarah like a slap to the face. She had already felt like an outsider, but hearing Ruby say it out loud was like a crushing blow. For the first time in her life, she realized that even in a place like this, she didn't belong. She wasn't wanted. Ruby's words stung, but there was no room for argument. Sarah had no choice but to pack her things and leave. She walked out of the brothel that night, her heart heavy with shame and confusion. Where would she go now? What would she do? Her mind raced, but there were no answers, only silence. She was alone again, but this time it felt different. The rejection was louder, more final. The next day, as Sarah wandered the streets, trying to think of a place to stay, she overheard a conversation that made her heart sink. The auctioneer, a man with a reputation for cruelty and heartlessness, was preparing for another one of his infamous auctions. The auction, as always, would be for women like Sarah, discarded, unwanted, and vulnerable. Sarah felt a sense of dread wash over her. The auction was her worst fear come to life, but it seemed that the only choice she had left was to go there and see what would happen. As she walked towards the auction hall, her heart pounded in her chest. She had never been this afraid in her life. Every step she took felt like it was leading her deeper into a nightmare. She didn't know how she had ended up here, but one thing was clear. Her life had reached its lowest point. What awaited her at the auction she couldn't predict, but she feared it would be worse than anything she had already experienced. Sarah walked through the streets, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The town around her felt suffocating. The same streets she had walked 1,000 times now seemed to close in on her. She had no idea what she was supposed to do or where she could turn for help. Her life had become a series of endless disappointments, and now, facing the auctioneer's cruel fate, it seemed like there was nowhere left to go. But in her heart, Sarah refused to give up entirely. There had to be something better out there, some way for her to escape this cycle of rejection and pain. As she neared the auction hall, Sarah hesitated. The building stood like a looming reminder of all the times she had been judged, looked down upon, and dismissed by others. The thought of walking into that room and being sold like an object made her stomach churn. She stopped in front of the doors, unable to move forward. She had come so far, yet now she didn't feel brave enough to face what lay inside. For a moment, Sarah considered turning around, running away, and finding somewhere, anywhere else to go. But she knew deep down that she had no choice. This was the last chance she had left, or at least it felt like it. Her heart ached, but she pushed forward, trying to convince herself that this wasn't the end. She just had to get through it somehow. The heavy doors of the auction hall creaked open, and Sarah stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, with rows of wooden chairs facing a small stage at the front. The air was thick with a mixture of smoke and nervous tension. The men sitting in the chairs didn't look at her with kindness. Instead, their eyes lingered on her in a way that made her feel small and insignificant. She stood there, her hands trembling, her heart beating wildly in her chest. The auctioneer, a gruff man with a cruel smile, stood at the front of the room, holding a gavel in his hand. He glanced over at Sarah, then looked at the crowd, his eyes scanning them like a predator sizing up its prey. "Another one," he muttered to himself, and then he stepped forward, raising the gavel to signal the beginning of the auction. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer began, his voice booming in the silence, "we have another fine addition to our auction today. This young woman, like all of our offerings, is here for your choosing. She's a clean slate, ready for whatever you desire. Let's see what she's worth." The crowd shifted in their seats, their eyes never leaving Sarah. She stood frozen, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, trying to stay as still as possible. She wanted to shrink away, to disappear, but that wasn't an option now. She had to stay, she had to endure, just like she always had. "Let's start the bidding at $50, the auctioneer called out, a wicked grin spreading across his face as he scanned the room. The men around the room began to murmur among themselves, sizing her up like they were choosing livestock. Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet felt glued to the floor. The auctioneer's voice continued, growing louder with each bid. The crowd seemed to grow more eager, more excited by the prospect of buying her, using her, discarding her when they were done. It was like she was nothing more than a piece of furniture, a commodity to be bought and sold to the highest bidder. The bidding continued, each price going higher, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to listen to the numbers. They meant nothing to her anymore. All she wanted was for it to end. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the voices, the laughter, the eyes that stared at her like she was something less than human. She thought about her brother, about how she had promised him she would find a way to make things better. She had failed him, failed herself, but there was no going back now. Just as the bidding reached a fever pitch, a deep voice cut through the chaos. "I'll buy her," the voice said, calm and steady. Sarah's eyes snapped open, and she turned her head to see the figure standing at the back of the room. It was a man in a sheriff's uniform, tall and broad-shouldered. His face was serious, with dark eyes that seemed to see straight through the crowd. There was something about him that made the entire room fall silent. For a moment, no one moved. The auctioneer, flustered by the interruption, looked at the sheriff in confusion. "Sheriff," the auctioneer asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. You want to buy her." The sheriff's gaze never wavered as he looked at the auctioneer, his voice unwavering. "Yes, I'll buy her." The crowd shifted uneasily. The sheriff wasn't someone who was easily challenged, and no one was brave enough to argue with him. The auctioneer hesitated, unsure of what to do. After a long, uncomfortable pause, he nodded reluctantly. "All right then," he muttered. "Sold to the sheriff." The sheriff stepped forward, his boots echoing in the silence. He didn't look at Sarah, but she could feel his presence beside her, solid and unyielding. The tension in the room seemed to lift slightly, though the air was still thick with curiosity and unease. Without a word, the sheriff reached out his hand, not to touch her, but to give her an unspoken offer of safety. Sarah didn't know what to think. This man, this sheriff, had just bought her, but she didn't know why. What did he want from her? What did he plan to do with her? She didn't understand. But for the first time in what felt like forever, someone had taken an interest in her. Not with cruel eyes, not with laughter, but with something else, something she couldn't quite place. Sarah's heart was still pounding, but a small part of her, just a tiny flicker of hope, began to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Maybe the sheriff wasn't like the others. Maybe he saw her as more than just a girl to be bought and sold. But she didn't know for sure. All she knew was that she couldn't stay in the auction hall, not with the stares, the whispers, the judgment. She didn't want to stay in a world that had turned its back on her, where people treated her like an object. The sheriff looked at Sarah, his gaze softening just a little. "Come with me," he said, his voice steady. "You're free now." The sheriff's words echoed in Sarah's mind as they walked out of the auction hall together. "You're free now." For a moment, Sarah couldn't quite grasp what that meant. Freedom? What kind of freedom could she possibly have now? She had spent most of her life struggling, fighting to survive, always feeling like she was one step behind the world. How could this sheriff, a man she barely knew, offer her freedom when her entire life had been a series of doors slammed in her face? But the way he spoke to her, calm, steady, without pity, made her feel something she hadn't felt in years, a flicker of hope. They walked in silence through the streets of the small town, the sun setting behind them, casting long shadows across the road. The sheriff's presence was reassuring, even though Sarah didn't fully understand why he was doing this. He was a stranger, after all. The kind of man who wore a badge and carried the weight of the law on his shoulders. He wasn't supposed to care about someone like her. People like her weren't the ones who were saved. They were the ones who were forgotten. The sheriff led her to a modest house just outside of town. It wasn't grand by any means, but it looked warm, inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile room in the brothel where she had spent far too many nights. The house had a small porch and the windows were clean, with curtains that fluttered in the breeze. It felt safe. "This is where you'll stay," the sheriff said, stepping aside to let her enter first. His voice was steady, but there was a softness in it, a quality that she hadn't expected from someone who had just bought her at an auction. Sarah hesitated, her foot hovering just above the threshold. "I'm not sure I belong here," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. She felt small in that moment, like an imposter, unsure of whether she should even be allowed to stand in such a place. The sheriff nodded, understanding her hesitation. "I know it's not easy," he said, "but you're not alone here. You don't have to be afraid." Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped over the threshold, entering the house. The air inside was warm, and there was the faint scent of something baking, something that made her stomach growl. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the smell hit her. The house wasn't big, but it felt lived-in comfortable. There was a small fireplace in the corner and a table with chairs set up around it. A few books were scattered across the counter, and a stack of papers lay beside an old rocking chair. It was a quiet, peaceful place. Nothing like the chaos of the auction hall or the harshness of the brothel. "I'll make us something to eat," the sheriff said as he moved toward the kitchen. "It's not much, but it's what I have." Sarah nodded, unsure of what to say. She sat down at the small wooden table, folding her hands in her lap. Her mind was racing. Why had he done this? Why had he bought her here, and treated her with such kindness? Was this some kind of trick? Or did he really believe that she deserved a better life? The sheriff came back a few minutes later with a small bowl of soup and a piece of bread. He set it down in front of her, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment before he stepped back. "I'm not going to force you to stay," he said softly, "but I'll give you a place to rest. No questions, no judgment. You don't have to decide anything right now. Take your time." Sarah stared at the soup in front of her, the steam rising from it. Her stomach growled again, louder this time, but she couldn't bring herself to eat. She had been hungry before many times, but this felt different. The food wasn't just a way to fill an empty stomach. It was a symbol of something she hadn't had in years. Care, compassion, a chance to heal. The sheriff sat down across from her, his eyes patient but kind. He didn't pressure her to eat or speak. He simply waited, giving her the space she needed. It was the first time in a long time that Sarah had felt like she could breathe. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah picked up the spoon. She took a small sip of the soup, then another and another, until the bowl was empty. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her feel like she could survive another day. She put the spoon down and looked up at the sheriff. "Why did you buy me?" she asked, her voice shaky but clear. "Why did you do this?" The sheriff looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. "I've seen too many people fall through the cracks," he said quietly. "I've seen too many people who didn't get a second chance. Maybe you think I'm some kind of hero, but I'm not. I'm just a man who doesn't want to stand by and watch someone suffer when there's something I can do about it." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. The sheriff's words hit her hard, not because they were particularly profound, but because they were so simple. He wasn't trying to save her. He was just offering her a chance, something she hadn't had before. A chance to rebuild her life one step at a time. "Do you think I can rebuild it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The sheriff didn't answer right away. He looked out the window as though he were searching for something in the quiet night. Then he turned back to her and nodded. "I think you can if you want to." Sarah's heart swelled with emotion. She had never been asked if she wanted something. She had always been told what she had to do, what she should do, what she was capable of. But the sheriff was different. He wasn't telling her what to do. He was simply offering her a choice. "I want to," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The sheriff smiled, though it was small and weary. "Then we'll take it one day at a time." As the night wore on, Sarah stayed in the sheriff's house, in the warmth and safety of a place she never thought she would be able to call her own. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time she felt like there was hope, like she could move forward. The sheriff didn't ask her to do anything. He didn't expect her to be someone she was. He just gave her the time and space to figure things out on her own. The next morning, Sarah woke up to the sound of birds outside the window and sunlight streaming in through the curtains. It felt like a new day, a fresh start. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she had been given something rare, the chance to begin again. And that, more than anything, was what she needed. The days that followed felt like a dream to Sarah. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she woke up to a quiet morning, the sunlight streaming in through the small window in the sheriff's house. She could hear the birds singing outside, a sound she hadn't noticed in the hustle and noise of the town. The air was fresh, and the world seemed different somehow, softer. The weight she had carried for so long, the weight of her past, the rejection, the fear, was still there, but it felt less heavy, like it had been spread out just a little bit more. The sheriff, Samuel, was already awake when she stumbled out of bed. He had been up early, as he always was, getting ready for his work as the town's sheriff. But unlike the strict, intimidating man Sarah had imagined, Samuel was kind, patient, and steady. He didn't pressure her, didn't ask her to talk about the past if she wasn't ready. Instead, he simply allowed her to take things at her own pace. For the first few days, Sarah didn't do much. She spent her time resting, sitting by the window, and trying to get used to the idea that she wasn't being watched or judged. There was no rush to do anything. There was no auctioneer telling her she was worthless. There were no angry people or customers, no cold stares or cruel words. It was a kind of peace she had never experienced before. On the fourth day, Samuel invited her to help him with some work around the house. It wasn't anything big, just small tasks like sweeping the porch, organizing some of the supplies in the shed, and fixing a broken fence post in the yard. At first, Sarah hesitated. She didn't know how to do any of these things. She had never had a proper home, never been taught how to care for one. But Samuel didn't ask her to do anything difficult. He simply showed her how to use the tools, explained what to do, and let her take her time. At first, Sarah was clumsy. She wasn't used to using tools or doing work like this. Her hands were soft from years of doing nothing but washing dishes or cleaning clothes, not repairing fences. But Samuel was patient with her. He never once made her feel stupid or incompetent. Every time she made a mistake, he simply smiled and said, "That's okay, we'll fix it together." It was this small kindness, this quiet way of teaching, that slowly began to chip away at the walls Sarah had built around herself. It had been so long since anyone had treated her like this, like she was capable of doing something, like she mattered. Slowly, the fog that had clouded her mind began to lift. She started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could learn. Maybe she wasn't as helpless as she had always thought. By the end of the week, Sarah had fixed the fence, cleaned out the shed, and even made a small garden in the backyard. The plants weren't perfect. They were simple flowers and vegetables, nothing fancy. But to Sarah, they were a symbol of something she had never had before: growth. Samuel seemed pleased with her work, though he never gave her praise unless it was deserved. His approval came in quiet ways, like when he simply nodded and said, "Good job, Sarah," with a look of quiet respect. But it wasn't just the work around the house that was changing. As Sarah spent more time with Samuel, she began to learn about him as well. He wasn't just a sheriff, a man of the law. He had a past too, one that wasn't as different from hers as she had first thought. Samuel had grown up in this town, just like most of the people who lived here. But unlike many of them, he hadn't taken the easy path. He had left the town for a while, traveled around, seen parts of the world that most people never would. He had come back not because he had to, but because he believed in doing the right thing, in making a difference where he could. "I don't do this job for the money," Samuel had told her one evening as they sat together, watching the sunset. "I do it because I want to help people. I want to make sure that no one gets left behind. That's why I do it." His words stuck with Sarah. She had spent most of her life thinking that people like her were always left behind, always forgotten. She had thought that kindness and help were things that were only reserved for those who had everything. But Samuel had shown her that there were still people who cared, still people who believed in second chances. One afternoon, as Sarah was sitting outside, she saw a group of children walking past the house, laughing and playing. They were so full of energy, so carefree. Sarah watched them for a moment, a pang of longing in her chest. She hadn't had that kind of childhood. She had never been able to run and play without fear, without worrying about where her next meal would come from, or if she would be laughed at by others. A small voice broke her thoughts. "You okay?" Samuel's voice was gentle as he came to sit beside her. He had been watching her from the door, concerned but not intrusive. Sarah nodded, though the lump in her throat made it hard to speak. "I've just never seen kids like that," she said softly. "They're so happy, they don't know what it's like to struggle." Samuel nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "No, they don't, but maybe you can show them what it means to fight for something better. To show them that no matter where you come from, you can make something of yourself. You're proof of that." Sarah swallowed hard, blinking back tears. Samuel's words meant more to her than he could ever know. She had never seen herself as a role model, never thought she could inspire anyone. But here, in this quiet home with Samuel, she was beginning to believe that maybe she could. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's confidence grew. She learned how to cook, how to fix small problems around the house, and even how to speak with the other people in town. Samuel would take her with him when he went into town to run errands or check on the local businesses. At first, Sarah was shy, not wanting to draw attention to herself, but slowly she began to feel more comfortable. The people in the town were kind, not like the cruel faces she had once known. They didn't judge her. They didn't see her as a broken person, but as someone who could have a place in their world. One day, while Samuel was away on a trip to the neighboring town, Sarah decided to do something special. She had been saving a little bit of money she had earned from helping Samuel around the house, and she wanted to do something with it, something that felt like a new beginning. She went to the local market and bought a small gift, a bright red scarf. It wasn't much, but it was something she could wear with pride. When Samuel returned later that day, she stood waiting for him at the door, a nervous smile on her face. He looked at her with curiosity, then his eyes softened when he saw the scarf in her hands. For me, he asked, his voice gentle. Sarah nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. For you to say thank you for everything. Samuel took the scarf, his fingers brushing hers as he accepted the gift. I'm proud of you, Sarah, he said quietly. I think you're going to do great things. It wasn't just the gift or the words that meant so much to Sarah. It was the fact that, for the first time in her life, she truly believed them. She was beginning to believe that she could build a new life, that she didn't have to be defined by her past. And that, more than anything, was the most powerful feeling she had ever experienced. As the months passed, Sarah's life slowly transformed in ways she had never imagined possible. What had once been a world filled with rejection and fear had become one of hope and opportunity. She had spent so many years running from her past, from the pain, the judgment, and the hurt. But now, here in Samuel's home, she was starting to build something real, something lasting. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stumbled into the sheriff's house, unsure of her worth. She had become a woman who could stand on her own 2 feet, with a purpose and a sense of pride. She no longer saw herself as broken or discarded. She had learned through small, quiet steps that she was capable of more than she had ever believed. The house was always quiet in the mornings. Samuel would leave early to take care of his duties, and Sarah would stay behind, her routine now filled with small tasks that had once seemed impossible. She would wake up early, make breakfast, and then spend the rest of the morning working on the garden, fixing small things around the house, or reading one of the books Samuel had left for her. She had never been much of a reader before, but now the words on the pages filled her with a sense of peace. She was learning about the world, about things beyond the small town she had grown up in. It was a freedom she had never known. One morning, as Sarah was tending to her garden, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned around to see Samuel standing there, his usual calm expression on his face. There was something different about him today, though. His eyes were focused, almost as if he had something important to say. Sarah, he began, his voice soft but serious. I need to talk to you about something. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't like Samuel to sound so serious. He had always been steady, the kind of person who kept his emotions hidden behind a calm demeanor. Sarah set down the garden tools and wiped her hands on her apron, her mind racing with possibilities. Is something wrong? She asked, her voice betraying the concern she felt. No, nothing's wrong, Samuel replied, his lips turning into a small smile. But I've been thinking about you, about your future. Sarah's stomach fluttered. She had never really thought much about the future. For so long, she had been focused on surviving the present. But now, with Samuel's words, the idea of the future suddenly seemed real, like something she could control. What about my future? She asked, her voice quiet but curious. Samuel paused, as if searching for the right words. You've been here for a while now, and I think you've come a long way. You've worked hard, you've learned a lot, and you've started to build something. I'm proud of you, Sarah. I've seen how much you've changed, how you've taken on responsibilities, and how you've grown. Sarah listened carefully, her heart swelling with emotion. She had never heard anyone speak to her like this before. Not even her own family had praised her, let alone someone like Samuel, a man who had given her a chance when everyone else had turned their backs on her. But I think it's time for you to take the next step, Samuel continued. I think it's time for you to start thinking about what you want to do next. You don't have to stay here forever, you know. There's a whole world out there for you, Sarah, and I want you to be ready for it. Sarah's mind raced as she processed his words. She had always thought that her life was set in stone. She had always believed that people like her didn't get second chances. But now, she realized, she had the power to change her future. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living. I don't know what I want to do, she admitted, her voice soft with uncertainty. I've never really thought about it. I've just been trying to get through each day. Samuel smiled, a reassuring, warm smile that made Sarah feel safe. That's okay. You don't have to have all the answers right now, but you have the ability to figure it out, and I'll be here to help you every step of the way. His words meant more to Sarah than he could have known. For the first time, she felt like she had a real future ahead of her. It wasn't just a dream anymore. It was something she could work toward. She could see it now, that distant horizon she had once thought was out of reach. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she was worthy of it. Over the next few weeks, Sarah began to explore what she might want to do. Samuel was patient with her, never rushing her, but always encouraging her to think about her dreams, her desires, her passions. She spent hours walking around the town, visiting local businesses, talking to people, and thinking about what she wanted for herself. It was strange, in a way, to feel this sense of possibility. It was as if she had spent so much of her life in survival mode that she had never truly stopped to think about what she wanted. One day, as she was sitting on the porch, Samuel came to her with a letter in his hand. It was from a local school, a place that offered training for women who wanted to learn skills in areas like cooking, teaching, and business. It wasn't a big school, but it was something. And it was a chance for Sarah to learn, to grow, and to prepare for the future. "This is for you," Samuel said, handing her the letter. "I think you'd be great at something like this. It's a step toward your future, Sarah, whatever that may be." Sarah looked at the letter, feeling a wave of emotion wash over her. She had never thought about going to school. She had never thought about getting an education or learning something new. But now, with this letter in her hand, the idea seemed both exciting and terrifying. Could she do it? Could she really change her life in this way? "I don't know if I can," she said, her voice uncertain. Samuel sat down beside her, looking at her with kind eyes. "You can. You've already proven that you can. You've already shown yourself what you're capable of. All you have to do now is take the next step, and I'll be right here supporting you." Sarah looked at the letter again. It was a small thing, a simple opportunity, but it felt like the first real chance she had ever been given. She had spent so many years thinking she wasn't good enough, that she didn't deserve anything better. But now, in this quiet house with Samuel's encouragement, she felt something shift inside of her. Maybe she did deserve better. Maybe she had always been capable of more than she had allowed herself to believe. With a deep breath, Sarah made her decision. She would go to the school. She would take the chance even if it scared her. She would start building the future that she had always dreamed of, one step at a time. And she knew that with Samuel's support, she wouldn't have to face it alone. As she stood up and looked out at the horizon, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The future wasn't as uncertain as it had once seemed. It was full of possibilities, endless possibilities, and she was ready to face them. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first arrived in this town. She had been given a second chance, a chance to rebuild her life, and she wasn't going to waste it. The past might always be a part of her, but it no longer defined who she was. It was the future that mattered now, and Sarah was ready to embrace it.